be applied in responding to climate change. Of course, having a policy, having a law is not enough. It's a precondition, I would say. But to having a result, an effective result out of that policies, out of those laws, necessarily we would need an implementation process that, as I said before, should be inclusive, should be effective.
Hey, good afternoon, good evening, good morning, wherever you are. This is Andy Revkin on a big day for climate analysis. A couple of technical issues here, but we'll get there. And today is the release of the IPCC's, the third part of the sixth assessment, which is focusing on mitigation options. How do you slow warming? How do you slow the buildup of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and other greenhouse gases? I'm going to go back to the live presentation where they're answering questions, including one from me. Let me just pull that back up on screen. And in a few minutes, you'll be joined live by 4 different authors, at least, of the IPCC report. So please share this with others now as you tune in. Just share the link you're watching on. So let's go back to, it's not the videotape, it's live. So hold on a second here. Share screen, Chrome tab. Little slides. Yeah, so here we go. And hopefully you're going to hear this. I think, let me know if you don't hear it.
Should consider the different participation of the different stakeholders, and it is a set of conditions that should be taken into account to have a chance of success as a result of this process. Reducing energy emissions, as has been already mentioned by my colleague Professor Ski, a good requirement to if we want to limit warming, for instance, to 1.5 degrees Celsius, would imply immediate and significant reduction in the greenhouse gases emission. And also, it means accelerated mitigation, but also it should be equitable mitigation. So the policies and laws in practice should consider this aspect. Also in the implementation process should consider this aspect that should be, I would say, a precondition for having a success as part of those processes. I mean, in short, the response is not enough. Of course, we have been experimenting in the recent past. As I mentioned in my presentation, there has been an considerably increase in the adoption of policies and law, and this is a positive signal, of course. This is a positive signal in terms of governance, in terms of interest with regard to participating in the solutions or responses to climate change. Is a positive, is a necessary condition, but it's not a sufficient condition. We need to think also in the part of the implementation, and to the extent that those policies and law are not only adopted, but also properly implemented in an equitable way, and an inclusive way, and an immediate sense, as has been mentioned. Of course, would be successful. Otherwise, we will be the gaps would remain.
Thank you. I believe Professor Ski also wants to add on this question.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really good question to ask. We can have laws, we can have things written on pieces of paper, but do they actually make a difference on the ground? And does it make a difference to emissions? Now, in fact, the report that we've written does assess literature from quite a number of studies that have tried to address that question very directly. Some of the studies by looking backwards and trying to assess what kind of changes in emissions have occurred, and other studies which kind of look forward and try to predict the effects of policies and regulations that come into place. So there are actually specific numbers in the report and specific numbers in the summary for policymakers. And some of the estimates lead to a guess that an estimate of about maybe 3.5% of current global emissions, our emissions would have been 3% higher had these laws and policies not been put in place. And other estimates actually go much higher. They suggest that emissions would have been 10% higher than they currently are if we hadn't had these laws and policies. So, we can lament the fact we are beginning to slow the pace of growth of greenhouse gas emissions. It could have been higher if we had not taken action. And the challenge now is really to step up the pace of that action. We have the tools, we have the regulations, we have the policies. We need to make them tighter, and we need to spread them more widely in order to make changes.
Thank you very much for that contribution. The next question is again for Diana. It's from Amy Westerveld from The Guardian. Can you speak to the roles misinformation and greenwashing play in impacting governments' abilities to effectively mitigate climate change?
Yes, thank you for that question. We do show that there are many opportunities and more wider opportunities available for both governments as well as businesses to take action, and individuals as well. Nevertheless, we do show that there is a significant implementation gap. So the promises of many cities, governments, businesses have not. We don't see the progress that they will be able to reach their promises, because there is the emissions are not going in the direction that where they would already need to be if we were to fully reach the targets that they have set. Nevertheless, we also see that there is significantly increased political will, and that will help us in reaching these targets, because, for example, as Jim already showed, there are 18 countries which have already managed to reduce their emissions as in response to their climate change policies. We also see that a very large number of cities have committed to net zero goals. So that means that there is increasing commitment, and when there is increasing commitment, there is also increasing attention to this. We also show that transparency, reporting, monitoring, and verification, these are all key to implementing our ambitious climate goals and ambitious policies, and we will only be able to achieve the full impact of these ambitions if we do implement also these as part of the policies and also different actions that businesses take.
Thank you very much for that response. The next question is again for the United Nations Environment Program Executive Director. It is from the Arizona Republic. Water security is a top and urgent climate matter in the US Desert Southwest, along with other aridifying regions around the world. What is the single most important thing for people living in those areas to understand about what they can do now to protect their access to this critical resource?
Thank you. I mean, I think it was the second report of this crop of IPCC reports that signifies that at some point in a year, 50% of the population are likely to be living in scarcity. And so this is absolutely an issue. So are we then, therefore, in these scarce areas, and I will distinguish between poorer regions such as the Sahel and a wealthier region such as Arizona, are we in the wealthier areas where scarcity prevails, living as if we had no scarcity? Are we being mindful of the kind of restoration activities, ecosystem restoration activities that we could do that would enhance soil moisture and therefore leave the little rainfall that there may be in the soil, also at the same time making them more fertile? Are we using zero watering gardens? What kind of hardware and machinery do we use for that is water consuming and that is otherwise that could be more water efficient? Do we understand that we can in fact implement and have a much lower water footprint while still living healthy lives with parks and enjoyment? So it is around appliances, it is around awareness, it is around use, and it is also around mindfulness, around storage and restoration in poorer zones, such as the Sahelian belt from Somalia on the one end and to Senegal on the other. Clearly there it is about restoration. This is why the African Union has started the African Green Belt that sees to and looks towards restoring what has been degraded over since the 70s, when we have seen this ever decreasing rainfall year on year, driven on by climate change. These are the kind of actions that we can take. And so that does become very critical. If I just may, on the issue of policies, the very issue is that having policies that stick, that are, as we heard, also transparent, but also that are reported on by media and held to account. That is where we see the needle shifting the fastest. Declaratory policies that are generic in nature are not the way we will get there. It is by getting quite specific, sector by sector, the building sector, the construction sector, the transport sector, as well as the energy sector. That's the way we will get there. And of course, incentivizing with instruments, be it taxes or tax breaks, to enable that these policies are taken up more fast. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We are also seeing some interest in the actual work of the IPCC. The Secretary mentioned in his opening remarks the voluntary contributions by states, as well as the pandemic. So to summarize those in a two-part question, what kind of support the IPCC is enjoying from the member states, and what has been the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic? This is a question for Dr. Abdallah Moqsid.
Thank you, Andre. Yes, IPCC is basing his work on voluntary contributions. And I will use 3V. It is about financial voluntary contribution. And as IPCC work should be neutral, because we are assessing research, but we should really be neutral about any kind of policy. This is why we are working with voluntary contribution, financial voluntary contribution. The second V is, and this is the big V, because it is based on the voluntary contribution from scientists. Thousands of scientists are contributing to the high quality of the work of IPCC. And I think I am happy to see in this press conference we have developed country experts, women, and as well as developing country experts. And this sixth cycle, thanks to the voluntary contribution, voluntary involvement for not only balanced regional representation, but also the openness for new new youth scientists. And this is thanks to this great V, we are providing a good assessment. The other V is a little bit specific for IPCC because IPCC is the best interface between policy and science. And we were not about to achieve an approval if we didn't have voluntary, disposition from government to listen to scientists to come with a consensus and also a sort of summary policymaker, that bring government and scientists in same table. But yes, of course, the sixth cycle it was a little bit, particular because it was the most intense in the history of the IPCC. We are releasing AC report, but also we faced the COVID-19 pandemic. And I am happy to say that for the three reports, three contribution, working group 1, working group 2, working group 3 approval session, all of this approval session were handled in virtual platform. And this, of course, requested a huge IT support, huge mobilization, but there are also some positive aspects. I can just give you the example of this plenary. We did have almost 1,000 registered delegation. 1,000 participants were participating or the negotiation of this plenary because it is virtual. But of course, we demonstrated that we managed the pandemic. The pandemic didn't stop IPCC to deliver, and we are hoping next time to can have it. We have it in person, but anyway, we will be able to use this virtual platform to manage any situation, thanks to all the disposition and all the collaborative work. And this is something I want also to highlight. I think this cycle was also a demonstration that there was an excellent collaboration between the 3 working group of IPCC, as well as between the Secretariat and all the technical support units under this 3 working group. This is what I want to say. Thank you.
Whoa, sorry. So we're going to pause the live stream. Anyone can catch up with it later on YouTube. Can you hear me okay, first of all?
I can hear you.
Great. And here's Karen. Let me just get that comment out of the way, Karen. Hold on one second. Oh, it's great to see you, you both. Thank you for doing this. I was just showing the live stream from the press conference, and just get rid of that. Okay. So this is Andy Revkin at Columbia Climate School. I write my Sustain What column at revkin.bulletin.com and use this platform since the early days of the pandemic to kind of make progress through conversation around these complex issues we face. And there's none that I know of more complex and challenging than addressing climate change, cutting climate risks, cutting emissions, driving warming. Today's release, of course, is the third part of the 6th assessment. It gets to be tangled. Essentially, this is the how do we do this part. Last August was the basic science update, then came just a month ago the impacts and adaptation options, and now we're into how do you actually slow warming and how do you stabilize concentrations of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. I'm thrilled that despite your exhaustion level and so much work you've been putting in, again, volunteer work, that 2 and possibly more authors from this report are joining us now to discuss their insights and takeaways. Here's Felix Creutzig from Berlin. Felix, I'm going to let you summarize your position. It's a wonderful one. I love the title, but I don't have it right in front of me. And Karen Cito at Yale, who's one of the most important figures assessing the role of cities in either making things worse or better as we head toward have a crowding planet, one losing biodiversity, one that's overheating. Cities, as this report says, can work in 2 different directions depending on how they're built out, and there's a lot of building going on. So first of all, just great to have you all both here. How are you doing? Karen, maybe you first. How are you doing?
I'm a little tired. I'm relieved. This is my second time around in this, and I will say it felt much more stressful. I wasn't sure it was going to get approved, but I'm just relieved. And I think the report is really strong, and the messages are there, and it's an important one. So I'm relieved, tired.
Yeah, and Felix, just a quick intro, and you tell people what your work is and where you are and how you're feeling.
Yeah, I'm Berlin-based, a different time zone, working as professor at Technische Universität Berlin, actually on human settlements, and at the Mercator Research Institute on global commerce and climate change. And yes, here in my role as coordinating lead author of the IPCC, a bit of focus on demand side aspects of mitigation. So what end users can do and what structural change is needed for that.
Yeah, and that's a big issue right now in Europe, including Germany, because of heating expense and demand and the long tradition of dependence on gas. And
yeah, it's a huge confluence of factors now. Like there's a crunch in energy prices, extremely high prices, especially in the gas sector, and indeed, like the energy security domain and the question of demand side reduction, also from a climate change mitigation perspective, go exactly together now, and of course, it's important what's possible and what's reasonable.
Yeah, and Germany, I think in the last 10 years, when I've thought about countries pushing toward a decarbonized future, Germany often got into the foreground because of the work on solar and electricity sources. But the heating, this shows you that it's complicated even in a country that's invested many billions of dollars in sort of new sources of electricity.
Yeah, we could say like Germany was a forerunner in the 90s and beginning of 2000, but then it became very lazy, and especially, of course, actually dependence on Russian gas supply increased over the last 15 years. A huge geopolitical but also climate change mistake, and Germany is definitely not a front runner in this domain anymore.
Yeah, it shows you that somehow we have to keep the pedal, as they say, the pedal to the metal. You know, and it's hard because we get these accomplishments and then we sit back. And I see Paulina Jaramillo is here from Carnegie Mellon University too. How do is it Jaramillo? Jaramillo?
It's Jaramillo.
Jaramillo, of course. How could I not get that?
Hi, Paulina.
Hi, how are you?
So
really tired, right?
Yeah. So group hug, right?
Yeah, long time no seen.
Well, it must be. Paulina, is this your first rodeo?
Yes.
So what do you think?
I need to process still. I think it was tough.
Paulina, you did great.
Thank you.
Wonderful.
I want to show a slide that shows you in the old days, you would all get together in a place. It was like a road show. And in the new days, it's been this interminable thing that we're all doing, you know, with this screen between us. So maybe, and actually, Felix, had you been in an IPCC report before?
Yeah, I joined Karen in R5 already. So we are now like basically 12 years together in 2 different IPCC cycles.
Right.
First time actually in the transport chapter, which is now presented by Paulina.
So maybe the two who've been in this for more than, actually, hold on. I think Leon's coming on too. His camera is not connected, but Leon, I don't know if you can hear me. You might have to try again. I see your devices are not connected. Leon Clarke from Bezos Earth Fund. Let me just send him a note. Again. Yeah, this is not Zoom. It's different. So anyway, has there been a fundamental difference in the virtual version? From what I saw from the IPCC, there's a lot more participation actually as a result. One of the things that was sent out. So what's the good and the bad of this? Maybe Karen first, and then Felix as the veterans.
Well, I think nothing replaces that human connection, right? I mean, I think that the fact that Felix and I worked face to face so many years ago, there's a level of respect and trust that you build from working with someone. And then that carries over. I think in terms of the approval process, it's very different when you have only a week and it's in person and you see the country delegates discussing and authors can discuss in person. Now that it's virtual, everybody has access to a lot more information. And I think that's good on the one hand. I think it's also raises the stakes and it's much more, as Paulina will say, I think much more stressful too, right? Because the expectation is that this is now being streamed and there's so much information. And so it's a very different set of experiences. And I mean, here's the other thing, the fact that Felix right now is in Berlin. We had country delegates from literally all around the world. So the last 2 days we were working nearly nonstop. And because we're Zooming, we're not in a place we can actually do that, which has a lot of problems. Yeah.
And that issue of too much information or like more than the real-time nature of everything, as opposed to paper, and is something that challenges journalism now too. It's a shifting landscape. How frustrating is it to deal with the reality of the IPCC having this boundary? After when is the paper? Where is the time boundary after which you could not incorporate new information?
It was like October 2021, so basically half a year ago. But it was also okay because we accumulated information for so many years, and then it was also okay for us to let it go and say,
"Oh, right,
let's write it down. Don't update anymore. We updated long enough." So And of course, it has the problem that it's not like super up to date, and obviously we can't include any information on the current geopolitical situation.
Right,
And
right.
it's a bit slow process. On the other hand, it has the advantage of being very consolidated. So it's really substantive what we write.
You know, I hadn't thought about that before, but there's been such a long lag since the last report that means you're right. There's just so much more volume of science to have considered too. Wow. Leon Clarke, who was at University of Maryland, I think just moved recently to the Bezos Earth Fund, has joined us. And I'm just starting by asking you each how you're doing after this epic journey. And Leon, your focus is decarbonization pathways?
Yeah, that's right. You mean in the report, I focused heavily on the energy system and energy system transitions. Yeah, and more broadly on decarbonization pathways.
All right, and well, welcome to the little class here. Thank you for taking the time to do this. And I'm going to show a couple of slides from the report just so people can we can walk through some of the things that we're seeing. Thank you again. And there are some questions coming in, which I will share with you in a bit. Let's see if this works. So I pulled this out and labeled it good news. This is a rapid, you can see the rapid rise in adoption and rapid fall in costs of photovoltaic, wind, battery components. So that feels like good news. I don't know if you each had one little nugget you saw in the work you are focused on that counts as good news. Maybe we'll go from Leon, the newcomer here, to up to Paulina, and then Karen and Felix. So what's a nugget of good news?
Oh, well, you're showing one of the most important ones. Yeah, I think one of the most important ones is that we're actually seeing, in some ways, I just don't think we've seen this before. What we're seeing that's new now and what's exciting is that we are actually finding that in many cases, these low carbon transitions are less expensive. As we say in the SPM, the report, and the parts I'm in, more economically attractive than a fossil intensive or high emissions transition. And this is a lot of it. PVs come down, winds come down, batteries have come down. And so there's actually really technological options out there in a way that we had before, but they weren't as attractive as before. So I think that's actually one of the biggest pieces of good news. And I would say others, but I will let my other colleagues step in as well.
So the barrier to change is lower essentially through the various reasons, things that have driven costs down.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think so.
So Paulina at Carnegie Mellon, what's one nugget of good news that you saw?
Yeah, so I worked on the transportation chapter, and this figure also shows the rapid declining cost for batteries for electrified transportation.
Right.
And I think that's good news. And you also in this one you have the adoption of electric vehicles, and it isn't just in developed countries, right? Because electric vehicles are not just our personal cars. Electrified vehicles can include like two-wheelers, 2- and 3-wheelers, electric buses, and the deployment of those is growing also around the world. So it isn't just good news for developed countries. There's some good news for developing countries where these electrified modes are also growing as a result of lower costs.
That's great. Yeah, and again, battery capacity, the capacity to do all these things is increasing. We will talk maybe a little bit in a minute about the downside there, which is the demand has driven prices for some of the commodities that go into batteries up really rapidly along with the war. So we'll see how long the good news lasts. And Karen, a good news nugget on the urban front, maybe?
I would say the main one is kind of hidden behind the figures that you just showed, Andy, which is that hundreds and hundreds of cities around the world are committing to net zero targets. So it's similar. It's a similar trend. So there are many good indications,
and
that we're on the right path.
Yeah. And Felix, you had a paper that came out after the deadline. You yourself were an author on about well-being and decarbonization. There are ways to do this that if the policies are shaped correctly, the harmful impact on people of the transition can also be limited. But what here feels like good news within the report?
Yeah, let me start actually with this figure because there's still more behind it. Like
Yeah.
if you look at the technologies, they are relatively small scale, like they don't have large unit size, and that's a consistent pattern observed. The technologies that are smaller, that can be produced at larger scale, they learn faster, so it's becoming cheaper faster. And this translates also for other end-use technologies. For example, we just discussed cities and of course buildings, and we know that heat pumps are really important to heat buildings with electricity, with of course hopefully low carbon electricity in an efficient way. And we also see this kind of development for heat pumps. And what's behind it is actually also, let me address a large open question, because obviously the speculation is now that these kind of renewable energies, like photovoltaics especially, can deliver a large chunk of electricity, but also of overall primary energy in 2050. And the question is really how much, because there's open discussion in the community, and I think that's one of the most exciting questions to follow in the next year, whether we go to a lot or super much renewable energies in 2050. So Leon and I have good discussions on it sometimes. Yeah,
I have a related question. I'm actually working on a piece on heat pumps and energy decarbonization in buildings. And it seems what I've been reading, both in Europe and the United States, is that sometimes we think too much about the device and not enough about the capacities to make the transition, meaning training, workers, regulations being aligned to facilitate devices coming into a house like mine that has steam radiators fired by an old oil boiler. So how much of this is the social back end and regulatory end? Maybe Leon, I know you think a lot about decarbonization pathways.
I mean, I can make a couple of comments about that. I mean, that's absolutely the case. I mean, there's going to be some instances where the technology isn't going to fit or seamlessly slide all the way in, and that's going to be true with heat pumps. But there's actually, I think Karen could probably talk about this as well from the urban perspective, but there's many opportunities for something like heat pumps. But I also want to point out something that comes up with this that I think we also have to think about. We often think about what might happen with fossil workers as we move out of fossil energy and the equitable issues that'll come up there. But the same thing is going to come up in something like moving to heat pumps and moving out of natural gas in buildings, because as you move that way, those of us who are wealthy enough can go out and get a heat pump. Not everyone can, but if that happens, then there will be people stuck with increasingly expensive gas over time. And so there will be societal issues that are going to have to be addressed as well as we move in this case. And they're not just going to be in fossil industries, but more broadly.
And Paulina, I know you think about that too all the time.
Yeah, and I think what you're talking about specifically with heat pumps is the shortage of labor that we're facing. I mean, there are wait times. The wait times for getting installation of some of these electrified end-use technologies is actually growing because the labor force isn't there. And so I think that is an issue that has to be addressed, but that it is addressable, right? We've seen it before in the history of in the United States specifically, right? With the scale up of the of the Green Deal and the scale up of production of steel and things like that during World War II, where the scale was very rapid. And so if we're thinking about workforce development as a part of the solution, that is something that can be included in the policy. And we know there's a lot of concern about what happens to the people that work in the fossil fuel industry or these legacy systems, where here's an opportunity for training and workforce development. And that workforce development, you need people that can apply and install and fix all the heat pumps where those are. And that's everywhere, right? That's in every city. And so it wouldn't require people necessarily moving out of their towns to get these new jobs. It's training people in their towns to do these new jobs. And I think that's an important part.
For sure. I know some of you have to leave pretty much right at the 45-minute mark. So if I want to get back to your Keith, what's driving you right now? Having gotten through this summary and knowing what's in the deeper report, what are the issues you feel aren't adequately in the ether, in the news, or the roadblocks that you really worry about? What keeps you up at night And maybe we'll start with Karen.
Well, we like to start with the good news, right? The good news is, wow, lots of stuff is happening. Lots of cities, national governments, subnational governments. There's a lot of climate action. That's the good news. But the bad news is bad, right? The bad news is that emissions are highest this past decade as they ever are. The rate of growth is declining, which is good, but we're not on the right track if you're looking at the metrics that matter, which is greenhouse gas emissions. That other slide that you showed, Andy, that's a good feel-good slide. Like, oh wow, adoption of EVs, that's great, right? But that's literally just the vehicle. That's not the goal. The goal is to reduce emissions, and that is not. Yeah, there we go. That's the bad news.
Right.
So what keeps me up at night is I've got a 15-year-old son who loves to snow ski. And we're like, are you going to be able to snow ski when you're my age? When you're in your 50s, are you snow skiing? Mm-hmm. And that's, it's real, right? And so we got to accelerate what we're doing. And I think this last conversation you just had about your STEAM leader, it's that we need to build capacity on so many different fronts. And the exciting thing is the technology is there, the prices are coming down, we need to adopt it. And we need to adopt these strategies on so many different fronts. And I think Felix's work on the demand side is so critically important as well, because we each individually need to take action as well as having enabling conditions created by governments. But I would say my soundbite is we need to accelerate. We need to, what did you start off saying, Andy? Like metal to the metal?
No, pedal to the metal.
That's right. That's what we need to do. We need to just ramp it up.
So this gets to this question of when urgency, we have this real-time urgency around energy right now because of Putin's war on Ukraine and coming on top of rising demand after COVID. And as we all know, there's a bifurcated sense of urgency. It means getting more gas into pipelines or into Europe while this other capacity is being built. Does the report get into that? How do you build policy that can satisfy near real-time energy needs? And of course, in developing countries, it's even more in the foreground. Their energy justice is part of climate justice. And we're coming into COP27 in Africa with a lot of African nations saying, hey, we have every right to develop our fossil fuels. And actually, I agree with them because they're such a tiny part of the historic picture. So does the report get into like, what would be the drivers of progress given those complexities? Who feels most strongly and wants to jump in on that?
It's a little bit beyond what's high resolution in the report, but there's one generic strategy that captures the main concern, and that's like, we of course need to reduce emissions all over the board, and we know that CO2 pricing is crucial and important here, but CO2 pricing is also a problem, especially for lower income households, and that means it must always be combined with something like a climate dividend, like a per capita redistribution lump transfer, and both on the global level, but also on the national level, because on national levels, we also, even in rich countries, we have the same issue. So like on an energy consumption side, there must be like basically a fair policy of lump sum cash transfer that's supporting the transition.
So this is sort of what the Paris Agreement and the underlying framework convention were set up to do, but rich countries so far haven't lived up to their part of the pipeline, it seems. Any again, before we have to close out with anyone, if you have a sense of what you and your unit, like at Carnegie Mellon or at Yale or Bezos, what are the things you can press on before we get to AR7?
Well, so I actually have a couple of things like related to the last couple of things, right? You mentioned developing countries and their need to develop. First of all, developing countries are very heterogeneous. I'm originally from Colombia. That's a very different country. The conditions there are very different to another country close to my heart, which is Rwanda. They're in very different development stages. Their challenges are very different, right? Colombia has 50 million people and an electrification rate of like 98%. Rwanda has 12 million people and 500 megawatts of installed capacity of electricity. That's very different, right? So we need to start thinking about developing countries not as a single group, but as very different groups or with different circumstances. And there are challenges, but most of my work right now focuses on sub-Saharan Africa, because I think there are a lot of opportunities there. Because you're starting from lower levels of development, costs of these technologies have been going down. There's opportunity to avoid locking of fossil fuel systems, right? So in the US, we're really struggling with thinking about how we retrofit our power infrastructure and our transport infrastructure so we can have electric vehicles. I honestly think that in some of the developing countries where the infrastructure is so small, then we can think about how do we build the power infrastructure so that it can support electrification of transport, right? Without having to retrofit things. I think the challenges there are around financing, and developing countries have, there's this discussion about equity. I think it should personally, and this is not, I didn't work in the financing chapter of the report, but I think the discussion should be about who's going to help the countries pay, not whether the country should do anything about it, right? Because wondering whether developing countries should be part of the engagement, that's kind of putting our head in the sand, because they have to. It's net zero globally. It's not net zero in developed countries.
Right.
But I think there are opportunities, and I'm very excited about that work I'm doing. Sometimes it's discouraging because I don't see momentum happening, but it's momentum at the systemic level, right? And it really is momentum from the leadership. So what kept me up is the lack of momentum in, the stalling of things in the U.S. Congress, for example. That's what kept me up. Because I think there's a lot of things that we can do. We just need to commit to do it.
I feel that same. I think everyone here, who at least in the United States, feels that same sense of urgency. There are some questions. I know I asked you all for that nugget there, but let's try to get in a few of these questions before you have to leave. And raise your hand if you're out. Who has to leave at 45, like in 4 minutes? If you could stay on a little longer, that'd be awesome.
Sure.
All right, so here's a question. Joshua Herrig says, basically, if you could wave a magic wand, first of all, congratulations. And then what would you change in how the mass media covers your report?
So I might chime in a way that's on this that I think it's not exactly answering it, but it's related to this and the last question. So I'll just first off agree with the others. What keeps me up at night is just, the bad news, right? Mm-hmm. But in terms of where we need to go, I think two narratives need to be adjusted over time, or hopefully we can adjust these narratives over time. And one of them, which I think is already changing, and Karen alluded to this, is this notion that climate is the job of national governments only. And I think if you went back in the US before our previous president, I think that was the perception. But perhaps a silver lining of the lack of interest from the federal government in our last president was that I think it really galvanized the subnational community in the US in a way that I think was extremely empowering. And that actually may have tremendously long-lasting impacts. And so I think that part of the narrative and the way the media thinks about it is critical. It's really covering what's going on everywhere. It's people, it's cities, it's businesses, it's states, it's provinces, it's all of those. So that's one. And then the second narrative.
By the way, I'm showing a question that directly gets at your point. It's as organizers, we use your data and information to bring awareness and changes to our causes from the
exactly.
From the grassroots up.
It's really critical to think about it, not to say, oh, well, we need to do this, and I hope our national government does this, because that's not going to do it. The national governments are responding to what happens below. And then the second, which is related, and I think gets at these questions about whether it can happen, is there's a narrative about climate that goes like this. It's costly to reduce emissions, but that's okay because it's going to be helpful for the climate. And I think until we understand that climate transformation, climate mitigation is development, it is actually a way forward. It is economic growth. It has economic benefits. It's going to be hard to make the case. And I think you look today, and as I noted, mitigation in some sectors is actually cheaper now. It's the best way to go. right? And you're seeing some of these technologies being better, but it also has all sorts of other benefits: air pollution, energy security. There's all sorts of benefits from doing it. And there's just this, it's instead of thinking about, hey, we could do low carbon development, or we could do fossil intensive development. How do we compare these? Which do we like better? That's a comparison we should be thinking about, as opposed to, hey, it's costly. The entire thing is framed in cost, and it's not even clear that those costs are meaningful something like 30 or 40 years from now. So to me, that's one of the most important elements of this, is to not have this cost framing, not to think about it that way, because that's not the right way to think about it. And I actually think the literature needs to catch up with that really quickly. And I think it gets at some of Paulina's points about thinking about not just the developed countries, but the developing countries.
Totally.
So anyways, that's a sort of a roundabout answer to that question, but I think it's really important. That narrative is going to be extremely critical, and it's a narrative that is changing on the ground right now, and people need to realize it and embrace it.
If I can add to that, I totally agree with that. It's also about the cost framing, that always, like, when there's change, it's framed negatively, because it's framed negatively because change could be seen. Change is a problem always. Of course, we need some change, but there are many positive aspects to that. Not all of them, obviously, and it also relates to a framing that always there must be more of a consumption side, when indeed sometimes to consume more intelligently, it has real benefits, especially for health. We know that the huge health benefits of more active mobility, of more healthy diets. These are two dimensions that are really beneficial for us and align super well with climate change mitigation. And I mean, this is like one of the main points, that we can really reduce emissions dramatically by, we say, 40 to 70% in end-use sectors. It's nutrition, mobility, and buildings, by drawing these options until 2050. Then it involves not only the consumers, we need policy guidelines for that, otherwise it won't happen. And as individuals, Leon just mentioned the different levels of governments, also people, but we as people are not only consumers, we are also role models, for example, or we are investors, or we are professionals. You as a journalist, we are scientists, but also architects, urban planners, transport planners. These professions are really important, and they deserve more attention in terms of, like, who can act.
Absolutely. Karen, there are several questions that came in about cities. And there's one here also about how we talk about these things beyond sort of conventional greenwashing. Are there ways people are talking about the problem that you find not productive? We could talk about net zero, which gets demonized, but at the same time seems to become a big part of the discussion. But Karen, maybe cities first, and then we'll get to that question.
I didn't fully understand what the specific city question was, Andy.
Well, I could put one up here. Well, someone asked about refrigerants. I think we think about we mainly think about CO2, but cities' role in, let me see if I can pull that one up as an example. I just had it here. It was from Ed Ablard, who's been focused on refrigerants. He said, I don't know if you got into that in the idea, and the urbanization, air conditioning, the things that come with big cities that aren't just about CO2.
Well, different cities have different capacities to legislate and govern things that actually happen within their cities. I mean, this is going to be one of the biggest challenges. A lot of the consumption-based emissions that happen in cities take place in other places. So I think this is a good example, right? So if you buy a refrigerator, there's the supply chain emissions associated with mining the materials, constructing your refrigerator, and end of life disposal of refrigerator. Those things are often not accounted for in your cities, and cities have very little that they can do to affect their supply chains currently. But different types of cities actually could have legislation that could require that, for example, certain products that are used within cities have to be made with, let's say, low emissions materials, et cetera, or have low GHG embodied emissions. I think we're moving towards that, and I think there are innovations in both accounting and things like RFID, where we actually know all along the life cycle of a product, what the emissions contents are. That's changing, and I think that's going to change what cities are going to be able to regulate within their borders. But I mean, here's the other thing. I want to connect to Paulina's point that in so many different cities in developing countries, there's very little capacity and governance to shape what actually happens locally. I mean, so a lot of the decisions that are made at the city level are made actually at the national level, and so the cities sometimes have a really limited capacity to shape their emissions profiles.
So we have a guest who's popped in. He was in the green room having some of the jelly beans. James Glynn, who's at the Center for Global Energy Policy at Columbia, has been tracking these issues for a while. And I reached out to see if anyone wanted to come in to ask a question or comment. James, what's on your mind, having started to dive into the report with these authors?
Thanks, Andy. Good to be here. I originally wanted to come on and ask the question about whether or not we're on track with the rates of technology deployment, thinking about the good news that you showed earlier on, Andy, about the cost declines with wind and solar, and that's the first thing that needs to happen. And there was a piece in Reuters last week, saying we're on track, and I would have been really interested to ask Leon and Paulina whether they agree with the deployment rates are on track to meet the mitigation pathways. But then Leon, about 5 minutes ago, made the point about costs, and one thing that is not really included in any of the global integrated assessment models is the damage costs. And we can talk about technology costs coming down all day long, but the framing about costs and including damages is one of the things that's still really missing in the mitigation pathway. And I'd really like to see where Leon thinks the literature needs to go in that area and in the modeling literature. I mean, there's a few pieces coming out from the Potsdam Institute that I think is being published relatively soon. I don't think it's in the report, but it really does reframe the cost benefit, flips the cost benefit when you actually include damages and the insurance costs. And it'd be nice to tease it out, because I think that would be really impactful in AR7.
Any quick thoughts on that?
I mean, I'll take the last one, and then maybe Paulina can take the first part. There were two questions there. So on the cost, I think I'll come to your question, but I really think there's three things when you get to the integrated modeling. One of them is what you just suggested, that we're not including necessarily in a lot of these models the damages from climate, and it's not there. It was recommended in AR5. We recommended that we should have it. We don't have it now. It's hard. We can come back to that in just a sec. The second, though, is a lot of this modeling is done in a way where it's not taking into account all of the, quote, co-benefits. I'm not clear why they're co-benefits. They're actually part of an economy, and things like air pollution, jobs, all of those are energy security. These are all things that matter a lot, and those are not included as well. They're considered co-benefits, and so they're not actually parts of those calculations frequently. And then finally, just to say sort of on the inside baseball part of it, the way that models calculate cost is often tied very much, this is getting into modeling, but the models are built off of today, and they're really sort of, how can I say it, tethered to today. And so it kind of follows what Felix was saying. They're constructed in a way so that they actually assume that going forward to fossil intensive is in fact the, quote, optimal pathway. And so anything from it's going to be a cost. And so all three of those are in place right now, and all of them are issues that I think are really skewing the conversation to this very, very refined way of thinking about what the economic attractiveness of different pathways are. It's being framed in terms of cost. But on the benefits, absolutely. I would just note, though, that for that argument to work, it has to be one where people are thinking that those damages that they only have so much control over matter in the long run. I think the strongest argument moving forward is, in fact, that irrespective of damages, this is something that actually can have a broad range of benefits. But yeah, there's no question that needs to go in, and the uncertainty is so high and the challenge is so high in putting in benefits. I think that's held folks back, but that should not hold us back. And in fact, we should be putting in those damages to the best we can. They're just extraordinarily complex. So anyway, that's to agree with you. But just to say, that's one of three things I think in my mind that are leading us down a path that's considering this to be not as economically attractive in some ways, a fossil intensive future.
Can I build on that a tiny bit? Because this relates to one of my big frustrations about the structure of the IPCC. You know, you got this. It sort of plays out like a TV series. You know, season 1, season 2, season 3, and you know, there's been all this talk of integrating the disciplines, of the crosstalk among the basic science, the adaptation science, the mitigation science. But at the same time, they still are separate questions too often when they are all interrelated. And the social sciences, I think you're mostly social scientists, I think. No, wait, tell me what you are. Actually, we didn't start with what's your PhD in, but you know, and I don't want to try to jam this in on this horrible day. We can do a chapter 2 of this discussion when we're off deadline, off of this crazy day. But it'd be good to know a little bit more from all of you about how to build those conversations that would allow you to integrate some of these more complicated metrics into how we chart pathways.
I think there are two positive developments, or two developments in the direction of R7, where integration becomes partially more possible. One will be a focus on cities, a current chapter, basically current perspective, because here adaptation, mitigation, because place-based becomes intrinsically together. And the other one is a higher focus on the health dimension, which I think because mitigation, adaptation, and health, like this triangle perspective, is super important. It becomes together in many, many different aspects. And there's now a global movement also from the medical community with Lancet Planetary Health, that puts a lot of information in there and builds its own community, and it will come in one way or the other into the IPCC process. And by this integrating via the health dimension, also mitigation, adaptation much better.
Karen and Paulina?
Oh, Paulina, you're muted.
Yeah. I bet that never happened in your panel.
Yeah, no,
conversation.
never. First of all, I have 3 degrees in civil and environmental engineering, I'm an engineer, for the record. So, I mean, there are a lot of things in my head right now after a very sleep-deprived weekend. But one of the things that I would like to see, maybe as a part of a reframing in the 7th assessment report, is this report we put together looks a lot at what are the technologies, what are the mechanisms that are available, and we're looking basically at the decision space or the solution space, and like, quite frankly, the solution space hasn't changed drastically in the last 15 years, in my opinion. I mean, it's like the costs have decreased significantly from some of these technologies, and deployment has accelerated, and they become more efficient. But it's not like we're talking about completely new solutions that never thought about before, right? We're still talking about solar, wind, electric vehicles, right? So I would like to see more work on how do we get these things actually deployed in the real world? Like, what are the barriers and the opportunities for getting these things deployed in different places of the world, right? What are the mechanisms or instruments that help us get these things deployed in the real world in different areas of the world? So I think that, I don't know if I'll ever be involved with the IPCC again, but that would be a reframing that would get me more excited about being involved again, rather than going back and looking at what's the cost of the technologies that we've been talking about over the last 20 years.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a really important point. As a communicator, I think all the time about one reason I'm not telling stories anymore, meaning I'm not writing a lot of this 1988 global warming article. I'm not going to do more of those. What I try to do is facilitate conversations or look at technologies or online communication tools that can drive awareness and change. So that isn't really in here yet. Is it in this working group 3 report, communication? And I don't just mean media. I mean,
it's not in any of the reports. It's like after you're done with the science, then you worry about the communications. Yeah.
Oh my God.
I mean, in many ways, I think, you know, the systems that we're studying for the IPCC report itself is like a microcosm of the entrenched infrastructure that we're trying to change. And that there is this path dependency. It's very difficult to change that.
I'm just showing something. In Canada, there's this myheat.ca, which is a way to look at the community scale at both energy leakage in homes from infrared and at solar adoption. And it feels like there's so much potential here, both to study change and to use these methods to sort of start to get community awareness of transition as a positive. So if that's not in this report, then that really is a huge flaw.
Can I add something? We have in our chapter,
Yeah.
we have actually something on that. And there are 2 dimensions here. The first one is values. So communicating according to the values that communities have makes a difference. Of course, like some people hold different values, but picking up those values makes a difference for actually mainstreaming some climate options. So that's a substantiated result. And the second one is what you just showed. It goes like sometimes called citizen science, but there's a larger thing behind it that's agency. So one of the things that's happening, agency. One of the things that's happening is that it's such a big problem and it's all encompassing. So what can we do? So there's a very quick step to not necessarily in the fatalism, but saying, okay, I can't do anything, and like breaking it down to small bits where we can do something, where individuals can make a small difference. That makes a huge difference, like to enable agency of everyone. That is partially, it can be just, I mean, say like planting a tree, right? It maybe it's a very little bit useful. It's really not a big action. But even if it's not a big action, it's very useful in getting agency to people, and this enables also larger scale transformations. That's a very interesting dimension. We just scratch on the surface of that, also because the scientific literature is not very solid on that, but it's a huge direction, and at least there are some pointers here.
Oh, that's so interesting. Yeah, Paulina, I saw your hand up.
Yeah, so to follow up on my other thought, so we're not even done with the sixth assessment report, and I'm already thinking about the 7th assessment report cycle. And part of that is that it's been a very stressful process and a lot of frustration at times. And I think, okay, how could this thing? And so one was what is needed to actually deploy these technologies? What's the barrier? But the other one is Working Group 2 report is all about, it's to follow up on Leon's point. Working Group 2 report is about the impact of climate inaction, basically. Can we have a Working Group 4 on the benefits of climate action, right? Or maybe, right? So that the way we have been quantifying the impact of not doing something, let's quantify the benefits of doing something. And it's air quality, it's equity, it's all these things, right? And maybe the issue is that the literature, the scientific literature on a lot of those things is lacking. So that might be a challenge.
Wow. So I wanted to see if James had one more question before he's got to go. I know you all have to go, and I do want to try to do a round 2 when we are recuperated, if you're into that, because these are really important conversations to drive. And hopefully everyone who's watching, this gets archived right away and people can share the video when we're done. And this manifesto, this idea of where do we go from here, I think is really an important point to dig in on. But James, do you have any last energy policy questions?
No, I think I'll leave it at that, Andy. Thanks for the opportunity to jump in.
Thank you for popping in.
Then I have one more comment then.
Absolutely, Paulina.
So I don't know if it was James or it was you who asked about like how would you like the press to cover the issue?
Yeah.
And early mornings on Twitter, there were some complaints that journalists were only getting 3 hours to review the embargoed, which I understand, right? But I kept thinking, well, it's not like this is the only chance you have to report on these on this work, right? And so I kept thinking, I'm a New York Times reader, and they have like the COVID, they have
Tracker.
like tracker, and if you
Right.
open the web app for the New York Times over the last 40 days, it's seeing what's going on in the Ukraine at the top. Can they have something like that for climate? What is going on with climate? Where are we, like, and it's like a constant reporting of, remember what this report told us we needed to do? Where are we with that, right? And that's where I think it cannot just be, oh, the report came out, this is what the scientists said, and then maybe we'll trickle some more stories later on, right? It should be like continuous. And so maybe like a dashboard of climate that is constantly there.
I think there are some people working at that kind of model for sure. I have friends in the media who are trying hard to do that kind of thing, but then it's like, how do you get people to look at it? Is the next question.
Yeah,
it's just such a challenge. Well, you know, any last quick thought that's just driving you right now? Otherwise, we'll call it a day. Karen Sito at Yale, who I've known for a long time through work I did at Future Earth, I think early on. Where we met
before that.
Yeah, it was
way before that. I think it was through Steve Schneider.
Oh, right. Yes. The great Momentum. Man, I think about him every week. He pops into my head like this little voice. I wish he was still in the IPCC process. Thank you, Karen, for being here. Paulina, thank you too. And Leon, we'll have to learn more about what the Bezos Earth Fund is up to. It's exciting that you've moved there. Kelly Levin, one of my favorite people from 15 years ago when she wrote that paper on the super wicked problem of climate change. I'm glad she's at the Earth Fund as well. And Felix Creutzig, we have a whole nother conversation to do on your work because we were exchanging Twitter messages about your work. So thank you so much for being here today on this Sustain What episode from Columbia Climate School. I'm Andy Revkin, and there'll be more along these lines. I'll be writing this up at revkin.bulletin.com. And one last time for all of you, just thank you for the, you know, it's like we thank first responders. I recently did there's a conversation with the FEMA director, the disaster agency in the US. And I said, can we also honor first preventers, not just responders? And I think, you know, a lot of what the science, the climate community and energy community has been trying to do is to be mitigators, if not preventers, of the worst that's coming at us through climate change. So thanks for doing what you do. Be well, get some rest.
Thanks, Andy.
Take care.
Thanks for having us. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Well, everybody, thank you for tuning in today. That was a really special moment in a very exhausting day for a lot of people. Please share this with folks on your social media platforms or just by email. And look to revkin.bulletin.com, my blog, newsletter, whatever you want to call it. And let's keep this conversation pushing forward in ways that are meaningful. Like what I talked about with myheat.ca. You know, there are tools out there, I think, that are underappreciated as pathways to spreading engagement and what was that word Felix used? Agency. You know, agency is a key commodity going forward as we think about what has to happen in the years to come. It's a long journey ahead. I'm glad you're following me, and let's keep at it. Take care. Be well.